And our new Director of Strategic Growth, John Drury. The room exploded in applause. My name had been on that slide this morning. I had seen it during the rehearsal walkthrough at 8:15. I had even corrected the font because the typeface was inconsistent with the company's brand standard. Name in the correct font on the promotion announcement slide. Now John Drury was walking to the front of the room while Peter Drury stood at the podium beaming the way a man beams when he has just done something he is very pleased with himself about. Peter Drury was our newly appointed Vice President of Operations. John Drury was his younger brother. John had joined the company 8 months ago in a mid-level business development role. Before that he had worked in restaurant management for 4 years. Someone behind me whispered, "Wasn't this Abby's promotion?" My pulse was so loud in my ears I felt it more than heard it. Peter did not look at me. Not once during the announcement. Not when the applause filled the room. Not when John hugged him at the podium in a moment that belonged in a family living room rather than a company all-hands meeting. I started clapping. Not because I felt like clapping, but because if I did not give my hand something to do, I was genuinely concerned about what I might say. And then, as the applause continued around me, something settled into place in my mind with the quiet weight of a door closing. This was not a mistake. This had been decided, planned, executed with my name corrected on the slide and then removed from it before the room filled up. Kept clapping. Kept my face composed. And I thought about the licensing renewal calendar sitting open on my laptop. 60 days. Peter had absolutely no idea what that meant. John hugged Peter at the podium, and Peter gripped his shoulder the way fathers grip their sons' shoulders in proud moments. "No one deserves this more," Peter said into the microphone. I felt the heat move up the back of my neck in a slow, deliberate wave. 3 years. I had given this company 3 years of work that routinely extended past 7 in the evening and frequently into weekends. I had built the state expansion licensing framework from documentation that was, when I arrived, a collection of expired filings and missing signatures that had left the company operating in 3 states without current authorization. I had fixed it. All of it. Quietly, thoroughly, without fanfare because that is the nature of compliance work. Nobody celebrates the absence of a regulatory crisis. They simply continue operating, unaware that the absence was engineered by someone working in a corner office that most people walked past without looking in. John had been at the company for 8 months. He glanced at me from the podium. Just once. The glance had an apologetic quality to it, the look of someone who knows they are standing somewhere they did not earn and cannot quite meet the eyes of the person who did. I gave him a small nod. My hand tightened around the folder I was holding. Inside it was the licensing renewal calendar I had printed that morning. The one I had been updating for 3 years. The one that tracked every filing deadline, every certification audit, every state board review across the 14 states where our educational software was sold. 60 days until the first major renewal cycle. 45 days until the certification audit. 30 days until the state board review in our 2 largest markets. Only one person in the company held the credentials to certify those filings. That person was still clapping politely in the 3rd row. The room drifted toward the catering trays and the kind of forced laughter that fills spaces after announcements that not everyone is entirely happy about. Peter found me 20 minutes later, near the window on the far side of the room. He approached with the relaxed confidence of a man who believes the difficult part of a situation is already behind him. "Abby," he said, keeping his voice low and collegial, "I want you to know this was a strategic decision. You are absolutely invaluable where you are. Your work is the foundation this company runs on." I had heard variations of that speech before. At other companies, in other situations. The speech that tells you you are essential while simultaneously confirming that essential and promotable are 2 different categories in the mind of the person speaking. Translation as I heard it. Stay quiet. Do the work. Know your place. Be grateful we still need you. "Of course," I replied. My voice was steady, warm even. His relief was immediate and visible. His shoulders dropped slightly. The tension he had been carrying into the conversation released. He thought I was staying small. He thought the conversation had gone well. He moved away toward another group with the satisfied manner of someone who has completed an uncomfortable task efficiently. He had no idea. I turned back to the window and looked out at the street below for a moment. I was not angry. I was not planning anything dramatic. I was simply clear. Clear about what I controlled. Clear about what was coming. Clear about what I was and was not going to do about it. And for the first time in 3 years, I was thinking about what I actually wanted. My name is Abigail Whitmore. I am 42 years old. For the past 3 years I have served as Senior Licensing Director at Keystone Learning Systems, a mid-sized educational software company headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, with product sales in 14 states. When most people hear the word licensing in a business context, they think of contracts, paperwork, administrative detail, the necessary but unexciting machinery that runs beneath the visible surface of a company's operations. What it actually is, in a company that sells educational software to school districts and state education boards, is the legal foundation upon which every single sale depends. Every product sale Keystone made in 14 states flowed through contracts that I had drafted, reviewed, or directly authorized. Every state operating license had been filed by my office. Every renewal required my certification signature as the designated compliance authority. Every state board audit request came through my desk. Without current, valid licensing in each state, Keystone could not legally operate in that state. Not reduced operations. Not limited operations. Zero legal operations. No sales. No contracts. No revenue from that market. I had built the system from scratch. I had designed the renewal calendar, established the certification process, registered the company's compliance authority credentials with each state regulatory body, and maintained every filing current across 3 years of changing state regulations. Peter had not promoted the backbone of his company's legal operating authority. He had handed that promotion to his brother, and he had isolated the foundation in the process. He had simply not paused to ask what the foundation actually controlled. When I joined Keystone 3 years ago, the licensing situation was genuinely alarming. The previous senior licensing director had left 6 months before I arrived, and the interim arrangement that had covered the gap had been neither thorough nor well documented. What I inherited was a collection of filing records that ranged from current to 18 months expired, a renewal tracking system that existed in a shared spreadsheet nobody had updated in 4 months, and 3 states where the company was operating on licenses that had lapsed without anyone appearing to notice. I stayed until midnight on my 3rd day of employment, not because anyone asked me to, because I had reviewed the records on my 1st day, understood the exposure on my 2nd, and could not in good conscience leave the office on my 3rd without beginning to address it. Within 90 days I had filed renewals in every state, corrected the lapses quietly through a remediation process with the relevant regulatory bodies, rebuilt the tracking system as a proper database with automated deadline alerts, and submitted a comprehensive compliance architecture proposal to the previous vice president of operations. He had praised my attention to detail in a company-wide email. He had called me the backbone of our regulatory standing in a performance review that came with a modest salary adjustment and a genuine handshake. He had not promoted me. Backbones, I had come to understand, are things organizations lean on rather than celebrate. The celebration goes to the visible work, the growth initiatives, the new market entries, the product launches. The work that keeps the whole structure standing is the work that gets noticed only when it stops. Peter Drury had arrived at Keystone 2 months ago as the new VP of Operations. He had spent most of those 2 months planning the promotion announcement. John Drury scheduled his first leadership team meeting for the Thursday following the announcement. I was not on the invitation list. I discovered this when the calendar notification that should have included me did not arrive. I checked the meeting details through the shared calendar system. The attendees list was visible. Every department director in the operations division was included. Licensing was not on the agenda. I sat with that for a moment. Not because I was surprised exactly. I had been reading the direction of things for several weeks before the announcement. The signals had been there in the way Peter engaged with John in meetings, in the topics that appeared on agendas and the topics that quietly disappeared, in the increasingly frequent conversations between the two of them that ended when I turned a corner. What struck me was the completeness of the oversight. John was now responsible for strategic growth in 14 states. Every one of those states required active current licensing to generate any revenue. The licensing renewal cycle was 60 days away. The certification audit was 45 days away. 2 of our highest revenue states had state board reviews scheduled in 30 days. And the person now responsible for strategic growth did not appear to believe that licensing was relevant enough to include in his first leadership meeting. I opened my master tracking spreadsheet and looked at the deadlines for a long, quiet moment. Then I closed my laptop. I was not going to remind them. Not yet. Not without being asked. The master spreadsheet I had maintained for 3 years was a document I was genuinely proud of. It tracked every licensing deadline across 14 states in a layered format that showed not just the filing dates but the preparation timeline required to meet each one. State filings do not simply require a signature on a given date. They require documentation assembled from multiple internal departments, completed 30 to 45 days before the filing deadline. They require pre-submission reviews by the relevant state offices in several states. They require certified documentation from our internal compliance authority, which was my role, submitted through a credentialed portal that accepted submissions only from registered certifying officers. The spreadsheet showed all of it. Deadline dates, preparation windows, certification requirements, contact information for each state regulatory office, historical notes on any filing complications from previous cycles. I was the only person at Keystone who could read that spreadsheet and fully understand what it was telling me. I was also, as of John Drury's appointment as Director of Strategic Growth, no longer the person whose job it was to act on what it said. The organizational restructuring that Peter had implemented moved licensing oversight into John's reporting structure. John was now the department head of record for licensing operations. State inquiry notices, regulatory correspondence, and compliance communications would be routed to his office. I looked at the upcoming deadlines one more time. 60 days, 45 days, 30 days. Then I opened a new email. The email I sent was professional, clear and brief. Subject line: upcoming compliance deadlines. Action required. I addressed it to John Drury as the new department head of licensing operations. I copied Peter Drury. I copied the company's legal counsel, a woman named Barbara Watts who had been at Keystone for 6 years and who I knew read every email she received carefully. The body of the email outlined the 3 upcoming deadlines in plain terms. The renewal filings due in 60 days, requiring preparation to begin within the next 2 weeks. The certification audit in 45 days, requiring documentation assembly from operations, finance, and product development. The state board reviews in 30 days for our 2 largest markets. I noted that each of these processes required certification from the designated compliance authority, and that the current organizational structure should be reviewed to confirm how that certification role would be handled under the new reporting arrangement. I did not use alarming language. I did not predict problems. I stated facts and asked a clarifying question. Then I submitted it and waited. The response from John did not come. The response from Peter did not come. 2 days passed. The response that arrived on the 3rd day came from Barbara Watts in legal. Her email was 4 words longer than my original and carried the focused quality of someone who had read a compliance memo carefully and wanted to make certain she understood the implications correctly. It asked me to confirm whether the required filings were currently complete under the existing oversight structure. Answered truthfully. They were not complete under the current structure. Within 1 hour of sending that reply, Peter Drury was standing at my office door. John had interrupted me during a team update meeting 2 weeks before this moment, and I want to place that incident in context because it matters to what came next. The meeting had been a routine operations update. I had been explaining a new state restriction in one of our mid-size markets that would require a modification to our standard distribution agreement before we could renew the contracts currently scheduled for renewal in that state. John had raised his hand in the middle of my explanation. We are streamlining our distribution approach, he said with the confidence of someone who has heard the word streamlining in enough business contexts to believe it is always applicable. We will not need that level of regulatory caution going forward. My stomach had tightened in a specific way it tightens when someone says something that is not just wrong but dangerously wrong in a way that could harm people who are not in the room. I let him finish. Then I sent him the relevant state statute by private email after the meeting, with the specific sections highlighted that explained why the distribution modification was not a matter of regulatory caution but of legal requirement. He did not reply. I had saved the sent email. I had saved the read receipt that showed the email had been opened 17 minutes after I sent it. I had added both to the folder I had been quietly maintaining since the announcement. Not as ammunition, as documentation. Because documentation is what protects everyone when a situation that has been developing quietly finally reaches the point where it can no longer be managed quietly. Peter appeared at my office door at 11:43 in the morning. He did not knock. He stepped in and pulled the door partially closed behind him in the manner of someone who wants a private conversation but does not want the closed door to signal that a private conversation is happening. His jaw was tight. The relaxed confidence he had carried out of the all-hands meeting 2 weeks earlier was entirely absent. "Abby," he said, keeping his voice low, "I need you to handle this quietly. The legal email is creating unnecessary concern." I looked at him steadily. "I am no longer overseeing licensing operations," I said. "That oversight was moved to John's department in the reorganization." He blinked. "You still have the expertise. You can still handle the filings." "Not without formal authority," I said. "The state regulatory bodies recognize a designated certifying officer by name and credential registration. My registration as certifying officer is current. But without formal authority in the organizational structure, I cannot certify filings on behalf of the company. The certification would not be valid." This was true. It was not a technical argument I was making to create difficulty. It was the actual operational reality of how state compliance certification works. The certifying officer must have documented organizational authority for the certifications to be legally defensible. The organizational authority had been moved to John's department. John did not hold certification credentials. I watched Peter's confidence waver for the first time since I had known him. It was not satisfying. It was simply clarifying. Barbara Watts from legal sent a follow-up email the morning after Peter's visit to my office. She had spoken with Peter, she wrote, and wanted to confirm her understanding of the situation in writing. She outlined the compliance structure as she now understood it. Licensing oversight had been moved to John Drury's department, the certification credential registration remained in my name, and the upcoming filings required certified submission from the registered certifying officer. She asked 3 specific questions. Could the certification credential be transferred to John Drury before the filing deadlines? State credential transfers require a minimum 30-day application review period with most of our state regulatory bodies, and several require 60 days. The first deadline was 30 days away. Could the filings be submitted without certification? State educational software licensing filings in every one of our 14 markets required certified submission as a condition of approval. Could the company obtain a deadline extension from the state regulatory bodies? Possibly, in some states, under specific circumstances. But extension requests themselves required submission by the registered certifying officer and needed to document the organizational circumstances that had created the need for extension. Barbara's email ended with a note that she was documenting the compliance status for the company's legal records and would be sharing the summary with the board's audit liaison as part of her routine compliance reporting. That last sentence was the one that mattered most. The board's audit liaison was a woman named Catherine Fields who took compliance matters seriously and communicated them to the full board without filtering them through executive interpretation first. Peter was about to have a conversation with the board that he had not planned for. HR confirmed the organizational structure in writing on a Tuesday morning. I had submitted a formal clarifying request after Peter's hallway conversation, asking HR to confirm in writing the current reporting structure for licensing operations and the designated department head of record for state regulatory correspondence. The response came from the HR director, a careful and precise man named Walter Hicks, who had been at Keystone for 8 years. Walter did not editorialize. He simply confirmed what the organizational chart showed. Effective the date of John Drury's appointment, licensing operations reported to the Director of Strategic Growth. John Drury was designated department head of record for all licensing-related matters, including regulatory correspondence and compliance inquiries. I printed the email. Not because I enjoyed having documentation of a situation that was causing the company real operational risk, but because paper makes things real in a way that digital records sometimes do not. When a situation is heading toward a formal review, the physical record has a weight that clarifies what was known, by whom, and when. I added the HR confirmation to the folder. The folder now contained the original announcement. The meeting invitation I had not received. The compliance deadline email I had sent and the non-responses from Peter and John. Barbara's legal analysis. Walter's HR confirmation. The state statute I had sent John with its red receipt. It was a clear, sequential, time-stamped record of a compliance situation that had been created by an organizational decision and communicated through proper channels without resolution. It was exactly the kind of record that a state audit board finds useful. The first formal notice arrived from the state compliance office on a Monday morning. It was a standard preliminary documentation request, the kind that precedes a state board review in our largest market. It requested confirmation of current licensing status, updated organizational charts showing the compliance authority structure, and a preliminary certification statement from the designated certifying officer. The notice was addressed to the department head of record for licensing operations. It went to John Drury. I know it went to John because Walter Hicks had updated the routing configuration in the company's regulatory correspondence system to reflect the new organizational structure, exactly as his job required him to do. John appeared at my office door 10 minutes after the notice landed in his inbox. He was pale in the specific way that people become pale when they receive a document they do not fully understand and realize that not understanding it has consequences they cannot yet calculate. "Abby," he said, "I got this from the state office. Can you handle the response?" I looked at the notice he was holding out toward me. I recognized the form. I had responded to that same form 3 times in 3 years. "That is your department's responsibility now, John," I said. My voice was calm and not unkind. "The notice is addressed to you as department head. The response needs to come from your office." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer. "I don't know how to respond to this," he said. "I know," I said. I heard John's voice from down the hallway, approximately 20 minutes after he left my doorway. He was on the phone with Peter. I could not hear the specific words, but the tone carried the urgent, slightly elevated quality of a conversation in which someone is explaining a problem they do not know how to solve to someone they are hoping will solve it for them. Peter's voice joined the conversation shortly afterward, coming from inside John's office. The door was closed but the hallway carried sound. I continued typing the document I had been working on before John appeared at my door. A routine internal report that was entirely within my current scope of responsibility. I did not smile. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters to how this story is understood. This was not a moment of satisfaction for me. I was not watching Peter and John scramble with any sense of pleasure. 2 people were in a difficult situation that had consequences beyond their personal discomfort. The company's operating licenses were at genuine risk. The sales team in our 2 largest markets was going to be affected if the filings were not handled correctly. People who had nothing to do with the promotion announcement were going to feel the impact of a decision they had not made. That was not something I found satisfying. What I felt was the steady, grounded quality of a person who has done everything correctly and is now simply waiting for the situation to resolve at the speed the situation determines. I had sent the warnings. I had documented them. I had been honest with legal. I had answered questions truthfully. This was not revenge. This was gravity. Peter called me into his office at 2:30 in the afternoon. He was seated behind his desk when I arrived. John was sitting in the chair to the left. Peter gestured to the chair across from him. Sep. Peter folded his hands on the desk in the manner of someone who is about to make a request they believe they have the authority to make. Abby, we need you to sign the filings and respond to the state notice, he said. Whatever the organizational structure says on paper, you are the person who understands this process. Just handle it. I had anticipated some version of this conversation. I had thought through my response carefully, not to be difficult but to be accurate. I cannot legally certify compliance filings without formal organizational authority, I said. If I submit certification without documented authority as the compliance officer of record, the certification is not valid. Depending on the state, submitting an invalid certification could be treated as a false filing. That is not a risk I am willing to take, and it is not a risk the company should want me to take. Peter stared at me. You're being rigid, he said. I am being accurate, I replied. If you want me to handle the filings, restore my formal authority in writing with board documentation. I will begin the preparation process immediately after that is in place. He looked at me the way someone looks at a person who has said something they recognize as correct and find deeply inconvenient. That takes time, he said. The deadlines do not adjust for organizational decisions, I said. John said nothing during the entire conversation. He studied the surface of the desk. I returned to my office and added a summary of the meeting to my folder. Barbara Watts submitted her compliance risk memo to the board's audit liaison on a Wednesday. She had told me she intended to do so, which I appreciated. Barbara operated on the principle that her job was to ensure the board had accurate information about legal and compliance risk, and that this obligation existed independently of whatever internal dynamics were affecting the situation. The memo was factual and precise, the way Barbara's written communications always were. It outlined the compliance structure, the upcoming deadlines, the current gap between the organizational authority and the certification credential, and the potential consequences of missed filings. The phrase regulatory exposure appeared twice. Catherine Fields, the board's audit liaison, responded to Barbara's memo within 4 hours with a request for a briefing call scheduled for the following morning. I knew about the memo and the call because Barbara kept me informed of developments that were relevant to the compliance situation I had originally flagged. She considered me a material resource in understanding the technical aspects of the situation. What I noticed, and what I found significant, was the change in Peter's behavior in the hours after the board liaison's response arrived. He had been coming to find me, walking to my office, knocking on my doorframe, trying various versions of the same request. He stopped. He stayed in his office. The door, which he usually kept open, was closed for the rest of the afternoon. For the first time since the announcement, Peter Drury was avoiding eye contact with me rather than the other way around. John came to find me on a Thursday afternoon, not in his capacity as my supervisor, but as a person who was beginning to understand something important about the situation he had been placed in. He did not come with authority. He came with the slightly deflated quality of someone whose confidence has been adjusted by events they did not anticipate. He found me in the small kitchen near our department area, where I had gone to refill my water. You could have warned us more clearly, he said. Not accusatory. More like a statement he was testing. I sent an email with the deadlines to you and Peter 14 days ago, I said. I copied legal. I asked a direct question about the certification structure. Neither of you responded. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't really understand what it meant, he said. I know, I said. And I meant it genuinely. John was not a malicious person. He was a person who had been handed a role he was not equipped for by someone who wanted to give it to him, and he was now standing in the gap between what he had been given and what the role actually required. The promotion came with the title, he said quietly. I didn't realize it didn't come with the actual authority. I looked at him for a moment. The authority and the knowledge that supports it are the same thing, I said. You cannot separate them by writing a name on a slide. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone absorbing something they will think about for a long time. 3 weeks after the announcement, A recruiter contacted me. Her name was Paula Sherwood. She worked for a placement firm that specialized in senior licensing and compliance roles in the educational technology sector. Her email was brief and professional. She wrote that her firm had been engaged by a client company seeking an executive vice president of licensing strategy. She noted that the role was a newly created position at a company that was expanding its state authorization footprint aggressively and needed someone to build the compliance infrastructure from the ground up. She also wrote one sentence that I read twice. "We have been monitoring some instability indicators in your sector and believe this timing may be of interest to you. Word travels in this industry. Compliance officers know each other. State regulatory staff know which companies are filing on time and which are not. When a company that has had a clean filing record for 3 years suddenly begins missing preliminary documentation requests, people notice." I did not respond to Paula's email that day. I was not ready to make a decision about my future while the present situation was still in motion. Making a significant career decision while in the middle of an active professional conflict is the kind of reactive choice I had learned to avoid. I saved the email to a personal folder. I noted the date. I returned to the compliance documentation I had been organizing in anticipation of the state board review that was now 22 days away. The state board had made their own inquiry, and that inquiry had specifically requested the original licensing architect. The state board review request arrived the following Monday. It was a formal document from the compliance division of the state education department in our largest market. The request outlined the scope of the upcoming review and specified the documentation and personnel they would require access to during the audit process. Under the heading Personnel Required, the document listed original licensing architect and designated certifying officer. That phrase, original licensing architect, was specific and intentional. State education boards do not use imprecise language in formal audit requests. They had reviewed our filing history. They knew who had built the compliance structure and maintained it across 3 years. They were asking for that person by function rather than by name. But the function described only one person at Keystone Learning Systems. Peter's face went a particular shade of gray when Barbara Watts forwarded the request to the full executive team with a note explaining that the original licensing architect referenced in the state's request was me. I received a copy of the forwarded email. I read it at my desk. Then I picked up my phone and called Barbara. "I saw the forward," I said. "I assumed you had," she said. "Peter's assistant just called to schedule a meeting for this afternoon. He wants you there." "What time?" I asked. 3 o'clock. "I will be there," I said. I spent the time between the phone call and the meeting reviewing the state board's request carefully and preparing the documentation I would need if the formal authority question was resolved and I was asked to proceed. I was ready. I had always been ready. That was never the issue. Peter's office at 3 o'clock held Peter, John, Barbara Watts, and me. Peter opened the conversation with the directness of a man who has run out of indirect options. "We need to reinstate your formal authority over licensing operations," he said. "The state board review is in 3 weeks, and they have specifically requested the original licensing architect. That's you. We need you in that role with full authority." "I will need the reinstatement in writing," I said, "with board documentation confirming the authority restoration. And I will need John's reporting relationship to licensing operations formally restructured so that the organizational chart reflects the actual authority accurately." Peter hesitated. It was a brief hesitation, perhaps 2 seconds. But everyone in the room felt it. The hesitation was pride. The documentation of a reinstatement was simultaneously the documentation of a mistake. It was a paper trail showing that the Director of Strategic Growth position had been created, announced publicly, and then had a significant portion of its authority reversed within 3 weeks. That was not a comfortable thing to put in writing. But the alternative was a state board review conducted without the original licensing architect because the organization could not resolve its own authority structure in time. That was a significantly less comfortable outcome. "Fine," Peter said. "Barbara, draft the authority restoration documentation today. I want it signed by end of business." Barbara looked at me briefly. I gave her a small nod that conveyed precisely nothing except that I had heard and would wait for the documentation before proceeding. The State Board review took place on a Tuesday morning. I arrived at the State Education Department's regional office with 2 binders of documentation. The first contained the complete licensing history for our largest market, organized chronologically from my first filing 3 years ago through the current period. Every application, every renewal, every correspondence, every certification. The second contained the internal documentation I had compiled, the risk warnings I had sent, the email to John and Peter with the deadline calendar, Barbara's legal analysis, the HR confirmation of the organizational restructuring, the authority restoration documentation signed 4 days before the review. I did not offer the second binder unless asked. The audit team consisted of 3 people. The lead auditor was a woman named Karen Howell who had been with the State Education Compliance Division for 12 years. She was methodical, thorough, and asked questions in a sequence that told me she had read our filing history carefully before the meeting. She asked about the organizational change that had occurred 6 weeks before the audit. I explained it factually and completely. The restructuring, the compliance notice I had sent, the legal consultation, the authority restoration. Karen Howell made notes at several points during my explanation. At the end of my account, she asked if I had documentation of the warnings I had sent prior to the authority restoration. I placed the second binder on the table. She read through it without comment. Then she looked up. "Thank you, Ms. Whitmore," she said. "This is thorough. Facts do not need to shout. They simply need to stand." The internal review that followed the State Board audit was initiated by the Board's Audit Committee rather than by Peter. Catherine Fields, the audit liaison, had been receiving Barbara's updates throughout the situation. She had also received Karen Howell's preliminary findings from the State Board review, which had been sent directly to the company's board contact as part of the standard post-audit communication process. The preliminary findings described the organizational change, the compliance gap it had created, and the company's response. They noted that the original certifying officer had provided timely warnings through appropriate channels before the gap became a filing failure, and that the authority restoration had been implemented in time to allow the review to proceed without regulatory consequence. The findings were not a formal citation, but the language was not complimentary about the governance decision that had created the gap. Catherine called a board session. The internal review that followed examined 3 specific areas: the process by which John Drury had been appointed to the Director of Strategic Growth position, the governance risk created by the organizational restructuring, and whether the circumstances of the appointment raised concerns about nepotism and appropriate management practice. John's promotion was frozen pending the review's conclusion. Peter stopped walking through the open areas of the office. He remained in his office with the door closed for most of each day. The confident posture that had carried him into the all-hands announcement 6 weeks earlier was not visible anymore. The review team asked to speak with me on the 3rd day. I brought my folder. Peter resigned on a Friday morning before the internal review issued its formal findings. His resignation letter, which circulated through the executive team before being shared more broadly, described his departure as a personal decision to pursue other professional opportunities. Nobody who had been paying attention believed that characterization. The board issued a formal governance statement the following week. It did not use Peter's name explicitly, but it addressed the appointment process for the Director of Strategic Growth position and acknowledged that the process had not followed the company's established governance protocols for senior appointments. It noted that the compliance risk created by the related organizational restructuring had been flagged appropriately by internal compliance staff, and that the company was strengthening its review processes for future organizational changes. John's title was formally revoked the same week the governance statement was released. He packed his personal items from his office on a Wednesday afternoon. I was at my desk when he walked past with a cardboard box. He paused at my doorway. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what it's worth." "I know," I said. And I did. He had not done this to me deliberately. He had accepted something he was offered without fully understanding what accepting it would cost someone else. That is a different kind of wrong than what Peter had done. Still consequential, but different. Nobody gathered in the hallway when John left. There was no applause. Just the sound of footsteps and the elevator door opening and closing. I returned to the document I had been reviewing. Paula Sherwood called me on a Monday morning, 3 days after the governance statement was released. She did not reference the statement directly. She simply said that her client's position was still available, and that they remained very interested in speaking with me if my circumstances had changed. I told her I was open to a conversation. The meeting with the client company took place at their Charlotte office the following week. The company was called Meridian Education Partners. They were 3 years into a national expansion strategy that would add 12 states to their operating footprint over the next 4 years. They needed someone to build the compliance infrastructure for that expansion from the ground up, establish the certification framework, manage the state regulatory relationships, and serve as the company's executive authority on all licensing matters. The title was Executive Vice President of Licensing Strategy. The salary represented a meaningful increase over what I had been earning. There were equity options. There was a direct reporting relationship to the CEO and a board seat on the compliance committee. The CEO, a woman named Ann Doyle, said something during the interview that caused my throat to tighten in a way I had not expected. "We are looking for someone who understands that foundations are not support roles," she said. "They are leadership roles. We want someone who built something once and knows exactly how to build it again, better and larger." I looked at her across the table. "That is exactly what I do," I said. She extended her hand. I shook it. I cleared my desk on a Thursday morning. There was not much to take. I am not a person who accumulates decorative objects in professional spaces. Few personal items. My personal copies of documentation that belong to me and not to the company. My notebook, which I replace every year and which had 3 months left before it would have been replaced anyway. I did not schedule a farewell gathering. I did not send a company-wide email. I answered the messages from colleagues who reached out individually with genuine warmth, because most of the people I had worked alongside at Keystone had been decent people doing their jobs honestly. I submitted my formal resignation to Walter Hicks in HR, effective in 2 weeks per my contract, and offered to conduct a thorough transition briefing for whoever would be taking over the licensing function. The offer was genuine. The compliance calendar still had deadlines on it, and the people affected by those deadlines had not done anything wrong. On my last day, I walked through the office in the early morning before most people had arrived. I stopped in the main presentation area where the all-hands meeting had taken place 7 weeks earlier. I stood where I had stood when Peter said John's name into the microphone. I looked at the front of the room where John had walked to accept an applause he had not earned for work he had not done. I did not feel anger standing there. Felt clarity. Peter had handed my promotion to his brother. He had believed that authority was a title he could assign and a name he could announce from a podium. He had forgotten something fundamental. Power is not a slide. It is not an announcement. It is not applause from a room full of people who will clap for whatever they are told to clap for. Power is knowing exactly what you control, and never requiring anyone else's recognition to know your own worth. I placed my access badge on the front desk on my way out. I pushed through the door into the morning sunlight, and for the first time in a very long time, I was walking toward something that had been built to hold me properly. The foundation was coming with me.